believe I had made the point that we moved out to Irvington at the edge of Indianapolis towards the east because my father was beginning to manage a filling station, and he felt that we could afford to move into a little more upscale area. Now, his station was in Indianapolis still, but on farther east was Irvington.
Now, was it a Shell station?
It was a Shell station, and I remember once saying to him, all I hear is Shell and Moose and Shell.
Now, Moose is...
And Moose was the lodge he belonged to. So his two interests were going to Moose Lodge meetings or working at the Shell station.
So how often did he go to lodge meetings?
Oh, probably once a month.
Oh.
And he found a number of his friends at the Moose Lodge.
Yeah, wasn't he a Mason too?
No, that was later.
Oh, later than what?
That was later. He was a Moose, a member of the Moose at the beginning.
Right.
And he found great comfort in going there and chatting with his friends and maybe even having a beer occasionally, although he never was much of a drinker. So anyway, Moose and Shell and Moose, and we were in the middle of World War II. So it was played against the backdrop of that as well. And I had a couple of uncles who ended up in the service. One of them never left the country, and one of them went to England to be a, what do you call it, who was a person who does the Morse code stuff. What would you call him? He was an informations officer.
Oh.
I think that's what it was. So we were that, and in Irvington we had all we needed to really have a comfortable life. And I believe I mentioned there was a movie house there where we saw war movies.
And it was called the Irving.
The Irving. And we saw war movies there and newsreels.
Right, I think you mentioned that.
About the war.
Something you mentioned before about, not in the video, you talked about you did read comic books?
Well, I had started reading comics before we ever got to Irvington.
Right.
When I was in my other school. And they were 10 cents a piece then, and you could buy them at the drugstore. They were very popular, all kinds. I tended to like not the Superman, but I sort of preferred Nancy and Sluggo, stories about young people.
But you also like Captain Marvel.
Well, I do remember Captain Marvel. For some reason, I like that one better than some of those others, like Superman or Wonder Woman. I didn't feel as comfortable with those characters. They scared me a little bit more. And so I had a stack of comic books that I would look at. And my friend Charlotte and I would often get together to trade comic books with other people. That was a popular thing, to trade your comic books.
Right.
So by the time I got to Irvington, I was not as interested in comic books as I was because I could go to the library very easily in Irvington.
Right.
There was a good little library next to the school. And I could
Your
go,
school?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I could go I could go in there easily on my own, and as I think I mentioned, I began to read Nancy Drew mysteries. So that was the kind of level I was at then.
Right.
Although there were other books that I don't... they were storybooks about people and their lives, mostly at that time.
Right.
And then occasionally, of course, the school would ask us to pick a special book that we liked and then give a book report on it in one of our classes. So those two Quaker gentlemen made a very comfortable, progressive community for us. And there were other grade schools in the area, and a couple of those grade schools were integrated, and not with a lot of colored, as we call them, but for some reason those families had settled there and felt very comfortable there. And there were lots of little stores that we could go to. There was a wonderful office supply store that I liked to go to and buy things that I would use in school or that I would give as gifts. And there were a couple of dime stores. And dime stores were popular then, too.
Right.
There was Danner Brothers and there was Woolworths. And that's usually where I would buy gifts for my family and friends at Christmas. Sometimes for as little as 10 cents with 2 cents tax. And there was a wonderful drugstore called Woolman's where I bought chocolate, hot chocolate sundaes for $0.25. And that was a special treat.
Now, was Kresge in... Do you remember a store called Kresge?
I do remember a store, but I don't believe that it was in there at that time.
Oh.
I think there may have been a Kresge's later. Much later. I don't remember which came first, but anyway, dime stores were common, and if I would go downtown with my grandmother who lived with us,
Yeah.
and to do a little shopping, we would usually end up at a dime store, and she would push me into a seat in front of her, and she would stand up and drink her malt, which she liked very much.
Right.
And I would probably have what was called a Coney Island, which was a hot dog and had a little bit of meat sauce on the top of it. So I became acquainted with downtown Indianapolis when I shopped with my grandmother. And there were significant department stores then, like L.S. Ayres, William H. Blanc, and H.P. Wasson. And that's where we would buy most of our things we bought downtown. But back to Irvington itself, I would often visit my friends in their homes after school in the afternoon.
Yeah.
And so I had a good group of girlfriends that I became involved with and close to. And other friends as well. You know, it just so happens that right on today, and I'm getting out of sequence here, which is my 86th birthday, that I got a birthday card from a boy that I first met when I went to Irvington in school number 57. And another thing I remember about school 57 is there was a persimmon tree right next to the playground.
Right.
And if you've ever lived near a persimmon tree, you know it makes a big mess unless somebody picks up the persimmons. And nobody was really doing that, so we would often notice out there as we went on the playground, which we did at recess when it was good weather. And the persimmons would be there, and that's how I learned about persimmons. And then we began to have kind of, what would I call it? we would have contests in the schoolyard. Simple contests, maybe short runs where we were running against each other, or we might throw balls, and I don't remember any basketballs at that time, but sometimes we would play a little baseball in the school area. But I really liked school. I was beginning to feel that I would like nothing better than be a teacher. And so I was observing teachers carefully, appreciating them for what they taught me. And I believe I mentioned before the English teacher who had a Shakespeare club.
Now, on the phone, I think when you were talking on the phone today, you were mentioning some teacher, a math teacher?
A math teacher.
Yeah.
She was my homeroom teacher.
Oh.
And I was never...
Hedgecoe? Was her name Hedgecoe?
Heathcote. I was never very excited about math, but I could do okay in it. And we were beginning to learn our times tables in junior high, and, we tried to keep up with that. And then another teacher, but
You learned that in junior high?
Mm-hmm.
Not elementary school?
Not so much. We probably started there, but we didn't get too serious about it because math was not as a single class at that time the way it was in junior high. And so, but our math teacher was also like to read to us during homeroom.
Oh.
And so I got used to listening to people read and began to enjoy words more and more. And then, of course, we had, as I mentioned before, we had a good art teacher, we had a good music teacher. They were giving us a wide range of training at that school and high school. And I thought Indianapolis schools were very good at that. They wanted to bring new ideas to all of their students.
Right.
Now, so it was a happy time in school. It was a happy time in Irvington, going to the movies. Oh, and that's when I learned to ride a bicycle. I was not good at riding a bicycle, and I had to learn how to balance myself. Again, PE was not one of my favorite subjects either. And I was learning to balance myself on the bicycle and riding a couple of blocks without falling over.
Right.
But that was important because that could take me over with other friends to what was called Ellenberger Parkway.
Right.
And there was a park there with a creek in it. And then so we could ride our bicycles and we could get off and walk along the creek and see the little fishes in the creek. And occasionally we would ride out sort of farther from Irvington, and then our parents would get after us and say, "You're not supposed to go out of this area." And and my cousins lived in Irvington, and I often went over to their house, and I remember my Aunt Frances making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for us all for lunch. And my favorite cousin at that time was a boy who was just 1 year younger than I was, who was learning to play the piano, and he liked to go on bike rides, and we shared quite a few hours of time together at that time. And he later became a teacher too.
Oh.
And a biology teacher.
Oh.
And his father was a police officer for Indianapolis. And I remember when and he later became what was called a detective.
Right.
And whenever he came to our house, he had to bring his gun with him. That was part of the routine. And so he would take the gun out of its holster and put it up someplace high, on a piano or wherever, so he could keep track of it, know where it was, but we wouldn't be in touch with it.